The Galactic Empire had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no one had ever dared to challenge its power. 17 elder species had built this mighty civilization together, and they controlled more than 1,000,000 worlds. Across the Orion arm of the galaxy, their fleets numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and their weapons could crack planets in half, and their armies had crushed every enemy that had ever risen against them. The Empire operated on a simple philosophy that had served them well for millennia. When their scouts discovered a new civilization, they would evaluate it carefully, and if the species showed promise, they would be uplifted and brought into the Empire as a client race. But if the species showed signs of aggression or independence, or if they simply existed in a region the Empire wanted for itself, then they would be quietly eliminated. This was not cruelty in the eyes of the High Council, but simply good management of galactic resources. After all, the universe was vast and dangerous, and it was better to remove potential threats before they could grow into actual problems. 300 years before this story begins, a scout ship from the Imperial Exploration Corps discovered a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an unfashionable corner of the galaxy. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, and those inhabitants were a species of clever apes who called themselves humans. The scout captain watched them for several cycles and recorded everything he saw. These humans had just begun to harness electricity, and they were building primitive machines, and they were killing each other in increasingly efficient wars. The captain found them fascinating in a morbid sort of way, but his report to the High Council was brief and clinical. The humans were aggressive and territorial, and they bred quickly, and they showed no signs of the social harmony that the Empire valued in its client races. His recommendation was simple, and it matched the recommendations that had been made for thousands of other primitive species throughout Imperial history: extermination. The High Council debated for less than an hour before reaching their decision. They would send a fleet to sterilize the Earth, and then they would mine its resources, and then they would forget that humans had ever existed. It was nothing personal, and it was simply the way of things. Fleet Admiral Torvax was given command of the extermination force, and he accepted the mission without enthusiasm or reluctance. He had done this sort of thing before, and he would do it again, and it was simply part of his duty to the Empire. His fleet consisted of 40 warships, and each one was capable of reducing a continent to glass, and together they carried enough firepower to kill the Earth 10 times over. The journey to the Sol system took 3 weeks, and during that time, Admiral Torvax reviewed the scout reports and planned his bombardment patterns and thought very little about the billions of lives he was about to end. When his fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, they detected exactly what they expected to find: primitive radio signals and chemical rockets. And a species that had no idea what was coming for them, Admiral Torvax ordered his fleet to advance, and he began composing his after-action report in his head. Then his sensors went blind. Every screen on every ship in his fleet filled with static, and every communication channel erupted in noise, and every navigation system began reporting impossible readings. Admiral Torvax demanded explanations from his officers, but they had none to give. Before he could issue another order, something struck his flagship. The ship shuddered, and alarms began to scream, and damage reports flooded in from every section. They were under attack, but from what and from where Admiral Torvax never found out. His fleet was destroyed in less than 4 minutes, and not a single ship survived, and not a single distress signal escaped, and not a single piece of wreckage was ever found. The Galactic Empire waited for news that never came. After 6 months of silence, the High Council grew concerned, and after a year they grew afraid. They sent a second fleet to investigate, and this one was larger and more powerful, with 100 warships and the finest crews in the Imperial Navy. This fleet also vanished without a trace. The High Council met in emergency session, and they argued for days about what to do. and in the end they made a decision that would haunt their descendants for centuries. They decided to do nothing. Whatever had destroyed their fleets was clearly beyond their current ability to fight, and the humans were just primitive apes on a single world, and surely they posed no real threat to a civilization that spanned 1,000,000 stars. So the Empire did what empires do when faced with problems they cannot solve. They classified the Sol anomaly as a navigational hazard, and they forbade any ship from approaching that region of space, and they buried the records of the lost fleets, and they pretended that none of it had ever happened. The 17 species of the High Council had more important things to worry about, and there were trade disputes to settle, and rival factions to suppress, and new territories to claim. The humans could wait, and if anyone asked about the Forbidden Zone around Sol, they were told that it was simply a region of unstable space and nothing more. Years passed, and then decades, and then centuries. The Empire continued to expand and prosper, and the memory of the lost fleets faded into legend, and the humans were forgotten by everyone who mattered. But the humans did not forget. In the darkness of their corner of the galaxy, they watched, and they waited, and they prepared. They studied the wreckage of the ships that had come to murder them, and they learned the secrets of hyperspace travel, and they built ships of their own. They sent invisible probes throughout the Empire, and they mapped every world and every fleet and every weakness. They grew stronger with each passing year, and their hatred burned cold and patient in their hearts. The Empire had tried to exterminate them like vermin, and the humans had decided that this crime would be punished. Not today and not tomorrow, but someday soon. They would make the galaxy remember the name of humanity, and they would teach the Empire a lesson it would never forget. And so, while the Empire grew fat and complacent, the humans sharpened their knives in the darkness, and they counted the days until their vengeance would come. 300 years is a long time, too. Wait, but humans are patient when they need to be, and this was a debt that would be paid in full. The forgotten species had not forgotten anything at all. Admiral Keth Voron had served in the Imperial Navy for 40 years, and in that time he had seen things that would break lesser beings, had fought pirates in the outer reaches, and he had suppressed rebellions on a dozen worlds, and he had watched stars die in the fires of war. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for the whispers. Every spacer in the Empire knew about them, even if no one spoke of them openly. Stories passed from ship to ship in quiet voices, and they told of strange things happening at the edges of known space ghost ships that appeared on sensors for just a moment before vanishing into nothing. Colonies that went dark for hours and then resumed contact with no memory of what had happened. Probes that returned from unexplored regions with their memory cores completely wiped. Theverin had always dismissed these stories as the superstitions of nervous crews who spent too much time in the void between stars, but lately he had begun to wonder his current assignment was to patrol the border sectors near the Forbidden Zone, and it was supposed to be a quiet posting for an admiral nearing the end of his career. But the border had not been quiet. In the past year alone, he had received 17 reports of ships experiencing unexplained sensor malfunctions and 8 reports of communication blackouts lasting anywhere from minutes to hours, and 3 reports of crew members who claimed to have seen impossible things. One navigator swore she had detected a ship larger than any dreadnought in the Imperial fleet, and it had appeared on her screens for exactly 2 seconds before disappearing. Another officer reported that his communication system had been hijacked for 30 seconds and filled with a language that no translator could identify. A third crew member had simply gone mad and spent his last days babbling about eyes in the darkness and watchers who never slept. Keth Voron filed these reports with high command and received a same response every time. The incidents were classified and the witnesses were reassigned to remote postings, and the matter was considered closed. Then 3 border outposts went silent on the same night. The outpost was spread across a region of Space that spanned 50 light years, and they had no connection to each other, except that they all monitored traffic near the Forbidden Zone. When Kethvorn arrived at the first station, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The outpost was intact, and every system was functioning normally, and the lights were on, and the air was fresh, but the crew was gone. 47 beings had been stationed at this outpost, and there was no trace of any of them, no bodies and no blood and no signs of struggle. Their personal belongings were still in their quarters, and their meals were still on their plates, and their duty logs showed nothing unusual up until the moment they simply stopped. The only anomaly was a message burned into the main display screen. It was written in symbols that the translation matrices could not parse, and it glowed with a faint blue light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Kethvorn found the same message at the second station, and the same message at the third. 132 Imperial citizens had vanished without a trace, and the only clue was a message that no one could read. He recorded everything and sent his findings to High Command and waited for instructions. The response came within hours. His report was classified at the highest level, and he was ordered to speak of it to no one. He was reassigned to a supply depot in the most remote sector of the Empire, and his crew was scattered across 100 different postings. The message was clear. Forget what you saw. Kethvorn obeyed his orders, because that was what he had always done. But he could not forget something was out there in the darkness, and it was watching them, and it was patient. He was not the only one who had noticed. Deep within the Imperial Intelligence Bureau, there was an analyst named Shirimoth who had spent her entire career looking for patterns that others missed. She was brilliant and obsessive and slightly paranoid, and those qualities had served her well in her chosen profession. For the past 10 years, she had been collecting reports of unexplained incidents throughout the Empire and feeding them into algorithms of her own design. At first, the data had seemed random and meaningless, but slowly a pattern had begun to emerge. Ships were disappearing along specific routes, and those routes formed a network that connected every major military installation, and the Empire communication delays were occurring at precise intervals, and those intervals corresponded to the timing of fleet exercises and strategic planning sessions. Probes were being intercepted in regions that just happened to contain sensor arrays and weapons platforms and command centers. Someone was mapping the Empire. Someone was studying its defenses and learning its secrets and cataloging its weaknesses, and they had been doing it for at least 50 years. Shirimoth traced the pattern back as far as she could, and she found that it originated from a region of space that was officially listed as a navigational hazard. The Forbidden Zone around Sol. She requested access to the classified files on the Sol anomaly, and her request was denied. She made inquiries through unofficial channels, and her inquiries were blocked. She began to suspect that someone very powerful did not want anyone asking questions about this particular region of space, so she did what any good intelligence analyst would do. She kept digging what she found in the oldest and most forgotten archives of the Empire, made her blood run cold. Records of 2 fleets sent to exterminate a primitive species, and records of those fleets vanishing completely. Reports of impossible technology and weapons that defied understanding, and most terrifying of all, a single image captured by a probe before it was destroyed. The image showed a ship. It was enormous and angular and covered in weapons that the probe could not identify, and it hung in space like a predator waiting to strike, and painted on its hull in letters that Shirimoth could somehow read was a single word: retribution. She understood then what was coming, and she understood that no one in the Empire was prepared for it. She tried to warn her superiors, but they dismissed her as a paranoid fool. She tried to publish her findings, but they were suppressed before they could reach anyone who mattered. She tried everything she could think of, but in the end she was just one analyst against the weight of an empire that refused to believe it was in danger. All she could do was wait and watch and hope that somehow she was wrong. She was not wrong. Watchers in the darkness had been patient for 300 Years, but their patience was finally at an end. The day of reckoning was coming, and nothing in the galaxy could stop it. It began at the 17th hour of the 427th day of the Imperial calendar year 12,847. It began everywhere at once. Across the Galactic Empire, spanning 1,000,000 worlds and countless light years, every hyperspace beacon went dark at the exact same moment. The beacons were the backbone of Imperial civilization, and they allowed ships to navigate the void between stars, and they carried the communications that held the Empire together. Without them, the galaxy became a collection of isolated islands separated by impossible distances on the throne world. The High Council received reports of the blackout, and they assumed it was a technical malfunction. They ordered their engineers to investigate, and they expected the problem to be solved within hours. On 1,000 military bases, admirals and generals tried to contact their superiors and received only silence. They activated backup systems and secondary channels and emergency protocols. Nothing worked on colony worlds and trading posts and space stations across the Empire. Billions of beings looked up at the stars and felt something they had never felt before: fear. The Empire had always been connected, and the Empire had always been in control. And now suddenly the Empire was blind and deaf and utterly alone, and the ships appeared. They emerged from hyperspace in perfect synchronization, and they appeared around every major military installation in the Empire at the exact same moment. Not dozens of ships, and not hundreds of ships. Thousands. They materialized around orbital defense platforms and planetary shield generators and fleet anchorages. They appeared at shipyards and weapons factories and command centers. They surrounded every strategic asset the Empire possessed, and they did it so quickly and so precisely that there was no time to react. The Imperial Navy scrambled to respond, but their communications were still dead, and their coordination was impossible. And every base was suddenly fighting alone against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. The ships themselves were unlike anything the Empire had ever seen. They were angular and predatory, with hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They bristled with weapons that Imperial sensors could not identify, and they moved with a grace that should have been impossible for vessels of their size. And painted on every hull in letters that burned with cold blue fire was a single symbol: a planet with a ring around it, Earth. The human ships broadcast a message, and it was transmitted in every language the Empire had ever known. The message was simple, and it was terrifying. 300 years ago, you sent fleets to murder our children. In their cradles, you came to our world with weapons of extinction, and you intended to wipe us from existence. You failed. We have spent every day since that moment preparing for this hour. Your fleets are surrounded. Your defenses are mapped. Your leaders are located. You have committed the crime of attempted genocide against the human species. The sentence for this crime is absolute. There will be no negotiation. There will be no mercy. There will be no escape. There will only be justice. This message is sent by the United Human Armada. Remember our name. The message repeated on every frequency and in every language, and it echoed through the halls of power on 1,000 worlds. On the throne world, the High Council finally understood what was happening. The primitive apes they had tried to exterminate 3 centuries ago had come to return the favor, and they had come with a fleet larger than anything the Empire had ever imagined. The first shots were fired within minutes of the message ending. Human weapons tore through Imperial shields like they were made of paper, and human targeting systems found weak points that should have been impossible to detect. A single human cruiser destroyed an orbital fortress that had taken 50 years to build. A squadron of human fighters disabled a dreadnought without firing a lethal shot. They were surgical and precise and devastating beyond measure. But the Empire was not helpless. The Imperial Navy had 12,000 years of military tradition behind it, and its officers were trained from birth for war. They rallied and they fought back with everything they had. On 100 battlefields across the galaxy, Imperial ships engaged a human fleet, and for a moment, it seemed like the Empire might have a chance. They outnumbered the humans nearly 10 to 1 after all, but the humans fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. They anticipated every Imperial maneuver before it happened. They exploited weaknesses that had been classified at the highest levels. They knew the names of commanding officers and the positions of reserve forces and the codes for secure communications. 300 years of watching and waiting had given them total intelligence superiority. The Empire was fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything. And worse than their technology, and worse than their intelligence, was their unity. The 17 species of the Empire had always competed with each other for power and influence and resources. Their fleets cooperated reluctantly, and their officers distrusted each other, and their strategies were compromised by political concerns. The humans moved as one organism. When one ship fell, 3 more took its place without hesitation. When one captain died, another assumed command instantly. Their coordination was so perfect, it seemed almost telepathic. They were not 17 species pretending to be one civilization. They were one species with one purpose and one will. And that purpose was the destruction of everything the Empire had built on the throne world. The High Council watched the battle reports with growing horror. They had thought the humans would demand tribute or territory or political concessions. They had been prepared to negotiate and compromise and give up whatever was necessary to survive. But the humans were not conquering. They were not occupying. They were simply destroying shipyards that had taken centuries to build were reduced to rubble. In hours, military academies that had trained generations of officers were evacuated, and then vaporized weapons research facilities vanished in blooms of antimatter fire. The humans were not trying to rule the Empire. They were trying to ensure the Empire could never threaten anyone ever again. And the worst part was that there was nothing the High Council could do to stop them. The day the stars went out was the day the Galactic Empire learned what fear truly meant. Admiral Kethvorin had been retired for 5 years when the war began. He had spent those years on a quiet agricultural world, far from the centers of power, and he had tried to forget the things he had seen during his service, the vanished outposts, and the mysterious messages and the pattern that no one wanted to acknowledge. He had almost succeeded in convincing himself that it had all been his imagination. Then the sky filled with ships and the communications went dark, and a message began broadcasting on every frequency. He listened to the human declaration, and he felt no surprise. He had always known this day would come within hours. A military shuttle arrived at his estate, and officers in formal uniforms informed him that his retirement had been canceled. The Empire needed every experienced commander it could find, and Kethvorin was being given command of the 7th Fleet. He accepted without protest, because there was nothing else he could do. His fleet was assembled from whatever ships could be spared from the chaos of the initial human assault. 32 vessels crewed by officers who had never seen real combat and armed with weapons that seemed laughably inadequate compared to what he had seen in the intelligence briefings. But the Empire had no choice. The humans had struck at every major fleet simultaneously, and the survivors were scattered and disorganized and desperately trying to regroup. Kethvorin was ordered to hold a defensive line around the Kethrian shipyards. These shipyards were one of the largest production facilities in the Empire, and if they fell, the Imperial Navy would lose the ability to replace its losses. He deployed his ships as best he could, and he waited for the enemy to arrive. Did not have to wait long. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, and Kethvorin counted the ships with growing dread. 147 vessels against his 32. He gave the order to engage, and his crews obeyed with courage that deserved a better fate. The battle lasted less than an hour. Human weapons carved through his ships with terrible precision, and they targeted engines and weapon systems and command centers with accuracy that should have been impossible. They were not trying to kill his crews. They were trying to disable his ships. Kethvorin watched as vessel after vessel went dark around him and escape pods launched into the void. And the human ships let them go when his own flagship was finally crippled. He ordered his crew to abandon ship, and he stayed on the bridge alone to watch the end. A human boarding party found him there. He expected to be killed or captured or tortured for information. Instead, they gave him medical attention and food and water. And they treated him with a courtesy that confused him completely. Their commander was a human female with silver hair and cold gray eyes, and she spoke to him in perfect Imperial standard, Admiral Kethvorin. She said, "We know who you are. We know you tried to warn your superiors about us. We know your warnings were ignored. This is not your fault, and we do not blame you for the crimes of your empire. You and your crews will be released unharmed when this war is over. Until then, you will be our guests." Kethvorin asked the only question that mattered. "Why are you doing this?" The human commander smiled without warmth. 300 years ago, your empire sent ships to murder 8 billion humans, men and women and children, entire civilizations and cultures and histories, all to be erased because we existed in space. Your masters wanted we survived, and we decided that this crime could not go unpunished, but we also decided that we would not become what you tried to make us. We are not here to exterminate your species. We are here to ensure you can never do to anyone else what you tried to do to us. Every shipyard and every weapons factory and every military academy, all of it must be destroyed. When we are finished, your empire will still exist, but it will never again have the power to commit genocide. That is our justice. That is our mercy. Take it or leave it." Kethvorin had no response. He was taken to a detention facility that was cleaner and more comfortable than many imperial military bases, and he watched the rest of the war unfold through news broadcasts that the humans allowed their prisoners to receive. What he saw was the systematic dismantling of everything the empire had built. Humans did not occupy territory. They did not install governors or collect tribute or establish colonial administrations. They simply destroyed military assets and moved on. Shipyards, burned fleet anchorages, were reduced to debris. Weapons research facilities vanished from the map. The Imperial Navy threw everything it had at the human advance, and it was never enough. The Empire assembled the largest fleet in its history, and it was shattered in a battle that lasted 6 hours. The Empire deployed experimental weapons that had been developed in secret for centuries, and the humans countered them with technology that made Imperial engineers weep with frustration. Empire tried to negotiate, and the humans did not even respond. They had said there would be no negotiation, and they meant it. 6 months into the war, the Empire had lost 90% of its military capacity. Its ability to project power beyond its core worlds had been completely destroyed. Its industrial base for producing weapons of war had been reduced to rubble, and still the humans had not killed a single civilian. They evacuated military installations before destroying them. They disabled ships instead of destroying them. When possible, they released prisoners with medical care and supplies. It was the strangest war in the history of the galaxy. The humans were fighting to win absolutely, and they were fighting to kill as few people as possible. Thorin realized that this was the most terrifying thing about them. They were not monsters. They were not mindless destroyers. They were simply people who had been wronged and who had decided to make things right. And nothing in the galaxy could stand against a species with that kind of purpose. The impossible war was coming to an end, and the Empire would never be the same. 6 months after the first human ships emerged from hyperspace, the war was over. The Galactic Empire still existed in name, but everything that had made it powerful was gone. Its mighty fleets had been reduced to a handful of patrol vessels barely capable of policing trade routes. Its shipyards were twisted wreckage orbiting dead moons. Its weapons factories were empty craters on scarred worlds. Its military academies were abandoned ruins where the wind howled through broken windows. The 17 species of the High Council had spent 12,000 years building an empire that could crush any threat in the galaxy. The humans had dismantled it in less than a year. On the throne world, the members of the High Council gathered in the Hall of Eternity to await their fate. They had prepared themselves for death. Each counselor had written their final words and made peace with their gods and said goodbye to their families. They sat in their ancient seats, surrounded by the symbols of power that no longer meant anything, and they waited for the humans to come and end them. The doors of the great hall opened and a delegation of 12 humans entered. They wore simple gray uniforms without medals or decorations, and they carried no visible weapons. Their leader was a tall man with dark skin and white hair, and eyes that seemed to see everything. He walked to the center of the hall, and he looked at each member of the High Council in turn. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He bowed, honored counselors. He said, "I am Ambassador Marcus Chun of the United Human Armada. I have come to discuss the terms of peace." The counselors exchanged confused glances. They had expected executioners, not diplomats. The eldest among them found her voice first. "We assumed you had come to kill us," she said. Ambassador Chun shook his head. "We are not here to kill anyone," he said. "We have destroyed your military because it was used to commit genocide. We have dismantled your weapons industry because it was used to build instruments of extinction. But we have no interest in ruling your empire or punishing your people. We want only one thing from you. We want you to remember." He produced a small device and placed it on the floor before him. A holographic display activated and filled the hall with images, worlds burning under orbital bombardment, cities reduced to glass and ash, species that had existed for millions of years wiped out in hours. The images went on, and each one was accompanied by a name and a date and a death toll. "These are the victims of your empire," Ambassador Chun said. "Every species you exterminated before they could reach the stars. Every civilization you erased because they existed where you wanted to expand. Every culture and history and future you destroyed because you could. We have spent 300 years compiling this record. It contains the names of 9,472 species. The estimated death toll is approximately 47 trillion sentient beings. 47 trillion lives ended because your empire decided they were inconvenient." The hall was silent. The counselors stared at the images with expressions of shock and shame and horror. Some of them had known about these atrocities, and some of them had not, but all of them understood now what their empire had truly been. "We could have killed you all." Ambassador Chen continued, "We had the power to exterminate every species in this empire, just as you tried to exterminate us. Many of our people wanted exactly that, but we chose a different path. We chose to be better than you. We chose to show mercy that you never showed to anyone." He deactivated the display, and the images faded. "These are our terms," he said. "Your empire will disarm completely. You will never again develop weapons capable of planetary destruction. You will never again send fleets to eliminate species you consider inferior. You will preserve these records of your crimes for all eternity. Every child in your empire will learn what was done in the name of expansion and progress, and you will remember. You will remember what happens when you try to murder a species that refuses to die." The eldest counselor rose from her seat. "And if we refuse these terms?" she asked. Ambassador Chun smiled without humor. "Then we will leave, and we will watch, and we will wait. And the next time you threaten another species, we will return. And next time we will not be merciful. Do you understand?" She understood. They all understood. The terms were accepted without debate. The documents were signed and the treaties were ratified, and the human delegation departed as suddenly as they had arrived. Their fleet vanished into hyperspace and the forbidden zone around Sol opened for the first time in 300 years, but no Imperial ship dared to approach that region of space. Not anymore. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that no one had predicted. The empire that had ruled through fear and force became something new. It became a confederation of equals where 17 species worked together instead of competing for dominance. New civilizations rose to spaceflight without fear of extinction, and they were welcomed as partners. Instead of eliminated as threats, the records of imperial crimes were preserved as the humans had demanded, and every generation learned the truth of what their ancestors had done. It was painful, and it was shameful, and it was necessary. The humans remained distant observers, rarely seen, but never forgotten. Occasionally, their ships would appear at the edge of known space and watch for a while, and then vanish. They traded with some species and shared technology with others, and they seemed to have no interest in building an empire of their own. When asked why they had chosen mercy over vengeance, Ambassador Chun had given an answer that became famous throughout the galaxy. Extinction is what you do. He had said, "We are not you, we will never be you. We choose to build instead of destroy. We choose to protect instead of conquer. We choose to remember instead of forget. That is what makes us human." Admiral Kethvoran was released from captivity shortly after the war ended, and he spent the rest of his life teaching at a civilian academy. He taught history and ethics, and he made sure his students understood the lessons of the human war. When asked what he had learned from his experience, he always gave the same answer. Never underestimate a species that refuses to surrender. Never assume that strength comes from size or numbers or technology. And never ever try to exterminate a civilization without making absolutely certain you succeed. Because if you fail, they will remember, and their children will remember, and their children's children will remember. And someday they will come for you, and there will be nothing in the universe that can save you from what you deserve. He died at the age of 147, surrounded by students who had never known a galaxy ruled by fear. His last words were simple: "Let sleeping apes lie." It became a proverb throughout the galaxy, a warning passed from generation to generation, a reminder that somewhere in the darkness between stars, there was a species that had been wronged and had chosen mercy. And that mercy could be revoked at any time. The humans never forgot what was done to them, but they chose to build a better future instead of destroying everything in revenge. And that was the most human thing of all.